My talk is called Ready to Share. It's a project I've been working on for quite some time at the Lear Center, and I've just refashioned it a bit to talk about how fashion relates to the Creative Commons. I think most people don't really know that there's very little intellectual property protection in the fashion industry. So they really don't qualify for any copyright protection, and they usually fail at getting any sort of patent protections either for any of their designs. I'm talking about shoes, dresses, shirts, complete outfits that can be knocked off completely legally, copied, point by point, with no legal ramifications. Not allowed to copy. They cannot pretend that the copy of the design that they've created was actually made under the auspices of any other particular design. This is one reason that a lot of the fashion houses actually decorate their designs with their logos and their trademark fabrics. They think if they do this, it'll be a lot harder for knockoff artists to knock off their work. But if you've gone to any trashy flea market, you'll see that they go ahead and try anyway. The reason that the courts have not granted any sort of protection to the fashion industry is because they see fashion as too utilitarian. There are all these component parts that are used over and over again in the creation of clothing and apparel, collars and pockets and skirt lengths, and they don't want any single company to have some monopoly over some aspect of garment design. But most of us don't really think about fashion as being too utilitarian. Instead, we think of it as a little bit of excess, something that is not necessarily needed at all in our lives. But I think this is what's really interesting about fashion, especially as an object of study for people who are interested in the Creative Commons. Here is an industry that really just deals with basic necessities, stuff to cover your bodies so that you're not naked. But they've raised it to an art form, and I think one of the main reasons they've been able to raise it to an art form is because of this extremely vibrant Creative Commons that they have. One result of the fact that you can copy with glee is there's a very open creative process that goes on in fashion design. Very different, I'd say, from what happens in the music industry or with photographers or filmmakers or sculptors. You name it, people with a lot of copyright protection are not allowed to copy in the way that fashion designers are. One of the interesting side effects of this culture of copying is that trends develop. A lot of people wonder, well, how is it that a certain color comes into prominence? Why is a certain texture suddenly important? Why is everybody wearing big fat belts? Partly it's because people can tap into the zeitgeist of fashion and they can copy the thing that in their mind sums up the moment and feels right for the moment. There are some people, obviously, who are at the top of a certain kind of fashion food chain. Trendsetters who come up with really original and new ideas in terms of design, and to some degree their ideas end up dictating a lot of the trends that trickle down from there. There's another set of high-paid, high-end designers who are not necessarily creating original and amazing new artwork, but instead have figured out a way to tap into what it is that people want. These people, to some extent, are more marketers than actually designers. But all of them admit, to some degree or another, that they're inspired by the street. They're inspired by how it is that people on the street decide how to combine fashionable items from very different realms. Whether it's an army surplus store, it's a piece of couture that they got from their grandmother, or it's some $7 jacket that they bought at H&M. Now, the fast fashion industry, and I assume that you probably recognize one or more of these logos, is, I think, the sector of the industry that's taking most obvious advantage of this culture of copying. They know they can copy a design by Anna Sui and really not get sued. Those designers sometimes get very angry about all of this copying, and others think of it actually as homage, as an admission that they have somehow tapped into what it is that people really long for at the moment. But I think the reason that the courts and legislators have not granted the fashion industry any more protection, and I'm talking here about the United States, but later on I'll talk a bit more about international comparisons, is because the industry is thriving. Over the last 10 years, that's when the fast fashion industry has really come into full stride globally, and still annual sales have risen. Sometimes you look at the copies that are available and you think, my God, how is it that anybody would pay $1,200 for a pair of Chloe shoes when they can get the Forever 21 version for $39.99? Well, if you try them on, you would probably find out there's a huge difference in terms of the quality and the way these things are made. And I think also the benefit for Chloe having knockoffs like this is that it creates a desire for the real thing, for the luxury item. So maybe you buy the Forever 21 shoes, but eventually you go into a Chloe store and you buy a little purse, something that makes you feel like you're participating in the brand. There are several other virtues of copying. I think cultural studies scholars have written quite a lot about the democratization of fashion. Now it's possible to participate in a fashion culture at every imaginable price point. Because of fast fashion, there's a faster establishment of global trends, which is really a good thing for the fashion industry, both at the high end, low end, and mid end. There's a cycle of induced obsolescence where trendsetters no longer will feel like they are setting any trends if the masses are wearing what they're wearing. So they need to move on to the next new thing. And this causes an acceleration in creative innovation. Sometimes the knockoffs are actually kind of better than the original thing. Not always, but it's especially delightful when it's really cheap and it looks better than the first thing. Some designers, like Stuart Weitzman, has complained a great deal about knockoffs of his shoes, but he's actually said in a few articles that I've read that it's challenged him to come up with more innovative designs. He's come up with heels that are much harder to create, that have to be made from particular composite materials that are very expensive, otherwise they'll crack. So the fact that copying is possible has really incentivized him to push the boundary further. This reminded me a bit of Charlie Parker and an infamous comment that he made. He said that he actually invented bebop because he was pretty sure that white people wouldn't be able to play it. There are also lots of incentives to not copy. Just because copying is legal doesn't mean that everybody does it all the time. There's a very powerful reputation-based system at work in the fashion industry, and not just at the highest level, also mid-level designers who are within a community and respected for a certain kind of style, a signature look that they've developed. And if you cannot develop a signature look, then you'll never be able to have the kinds of collections that people will recognize as your work. A strange analogy maybe is to comedians who they can't copyright their jokes. So for a comedian to just have a series of little one-liners, there's a good chance that people are going to steal those jokes because it's very easy to steal a one-liner. But if you develop a full persona, a very quirky sort of signature style, and everything that you say is a joke, but it really only works within the context of your work, then it's much harder for people to steal it. The counterintuitive thing, I think some people would say it's counterintuitive to a culture of copying, is that you don't really have a totally homogeneous industry where everything looks exactly the same. There's no incentive to create anything new. Actually, it's exactly the opposite. It's because people have a license to sample from across the creative landscape that things are reinvented constantly. One interesting permutation is that a lot of the high-end respected designers have actually joined forces with the low-end retailers to create their own lines there. It's an act of self-copying in a way. They realize that if they should market their image and their work at a lower price point, they're probably just doing great PR for themselves, not cannibalizing their own market. I just like ready to share. Look at that, it's cute. You may be thinking that these examples that I'm talking about from the United States are somehow aberrant. That the US doesn't care about fashion designers, they don't treat them like artists, but they treat them like artists in France. But if you really take a look at other nations' legal structure for protection of apparel, you'll see that there's really no scheme that works. In Japan, there's a design law here explicitly covers apparel, but the novelty standard is so high that there's really no way to get that kind of protection. The garment has to be absolutely unique. It can never have existed before. It's like the novelty requirement for a patent in the United States. European Union has a design system, and apparel is explicitly protected, much less stringent novelty standard than Japan. But hardly any designers even use the system. They don't register, and there's been very little litigation. One reason is because the novelty standard is just too low. In 2006, there were over 6,400 registrations of garments, 6,400 in all of the European Union. Hardly any of them, none of them actually, were from high-end designers. But over 400 of them were from Nike, and 100 of them were t-shirts that you could hardly tell apart from one another. So the story is that you can actually get design protection in the EU for a design that's fairly different from another design. So in that respect, you're not really protecting anything. A knockoff artist would be able to actually register a knockoff of your work. But it's not just the fashion industry. There are several others. It's a quirky, interesting combination, collection of industries that operate in this sort of low IP zone. One of them is food. You can't copyright recipes or dishes. Cars, the look and feel of a car, there's no copyright protection there. Furniture, same thing. Too utilitarian. Magic tricks, unprotected. Hairstyles, idea, expression, performance, too difficult, not protected. Open source software, as you know. Computer databases, though there are some efforts to try to protect those. Tattoos, they do have some copyright protection, but they don't really use it. They steal from one another all the time. Comedy, as I mentioned. Fireworks. Games, the rules of games. Perfume, you can patent a combination of chemicals, but you can't, but it's so easy to circumvent that and make a fragrance in another way that for knockoff artists, it's very easy to circumvent. And while these industries may sound sort of marginal, sort of fun and quirky, if you look at the gross revenues for a few of them that have very little IP protection, you compare them to ones that have very high IP protection, you can see that these are big dogs. So, it seems to me that it would be very helpful to take a look at, in particular, at this collection of industries, not just the fashion industry, though that's the one that I've been studying the most, but others as well that have very little intellectual property protection, but there's a great deal of innovation going on there. How do those businesses function? And conceptually, how do we try to understand how they relate to other sorts of businesses and other sorts of creative industries that don't have the same kind of configuration within a copyright rubric? This is just my stab, an attempt to try to figure out how to place these in some sort of conceptual rubric. I think one thing that I was craving as I was putting this presentation together was some sort of visual presentation of what the issues are. I want to become literate about what it means to be creative, what it means to own creative objects, and to figure out how the legal system has tried to tease that out in a sort of abstract and conceptual way. This is my second attempt to sort of figure that out. And I think one of the main difficulties that we see with a lot of businesses that have now are now suffering because the because the products that they have created have now become non-excludable and non-rival products. You can buy them, you can trade them as bits in the digital ether. It becomes much harder to figure out how to control the ownership of that intellectual property. And that there's a weird sort of netherworld in the center here of all sorts of activities and performances and temporary manifestations of creative work that is very hard to conceptualize in terms of whether something is simply an idea or a firm expression. It's a whole series of dueling forces at work in intellectual property law, and I think we're not necessarily asked to think about this in a very sort of conceptual and abstract way. And I think it would be very helpful to actually come up with a rubric that would help us better to be more proactive about our insistence that there is a way in which the Creative Commons can actually be a functional force within a commercial environment. So I have a few suggestions for research. I'm a researcher, so I'm just praying that you guys will do this research for me. The first thing that I would request is sort of identification of best practices. Within this cohort of industries that have very little IP protection, what are they doing right? How is the system functioning? Is there a way that we can export those principles and those practices to other industries that are suffering right now, even though they have high intellectual property protection? I think we have to pay perhaps closer attention to the bottom line. We need to take seriously people who are incredibly skeptical about the economic viability of a commons. We also need to foster multidisciplinary research. Lawyers are great, we love them, we need them, but we also need, historians, we need sociologists who can tell us a little bit about how social value is created. We need economists, obviously. And you know, we need English majors like me to talk about the cultural aspects of it. Also, we need to come up with a really sort of clear, articulated position that will explain to those industries who are currently without IP protection, but they're seeking it out. We need to explain to them why it is that that might not benefit them. So that's it. If you have any desire to know more about this project, Ready to Share, visit our website, readytoshare.org. We published a book on this topic and held a conference, and all the videos on the website. So thank you.